to bring us a really important but heavy topic is an extraordinarily talented student from the beginning, somebody who just, to me, evidenced really, I just use the word elite intellectual aptitude to get stuff quick, to articulate complicated stuff quickly, and a whole hell of a lot of confidence too, which is good. Something I took me a long time to develop. But I think that that Anneliese is our next presenter. Really, a student that has, I think, been extraordinarily important student in this program, and one that I've learned a lot from, and expect very, very big things from, both in this presentation and after graduation. So Anneliese is our next presenter, no pressure. MEMENTO MORI, the futures of burial practices and cemeteries in the United States. Anneliese.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just a couple disclaimers as I'm getting started here. As Corey kind of mentioned, this is a heavy topic, so if any of you aren't comfortable with engaging with this information at this point in time, feel free to step out. I absolutely will not be offended. Totally understand. That being said, I do want to mention there's no graphic images in this presentation or anything like that. Just want to let everybody know up front. Other thing I want to mention is this project, the purpose of it is not to advocate for any particular type of burial practice. Everybody has their own personal values, personal beliefs. Absolutely want to respect those. I'm just here to give you guys information about what's most carbon friendly and kind of encourage that origin of discussion. So with that, I will get into it. First and foremost, just a brief overview here. We're going to start with motivations behind the project. I'll give you guys some context and background and kind of where this came from, where we're going sort of thing. Then I'll go into my actual project, research questions, methodology, and then my results and implications. We love those. And then I'll finish up with opportunities for further research because there's a lot, and I'll wrap up with some acknowledgments at the very end. So first and foremost, I'm sure most people in this room are wondering why the heck I wanted to spend a year thinking about death. The first thing, this all kind of originated because my dad sent me an article about natural organic reduction, which I will get into in a minute here too here. And I kind of just couldn't get it out of my head. And I started doing more and more research about the topic. I was really curious, trying to find more information, and had a really hard time finding more. And so I was kind of like, well, you know, I have this capstone I have to do. Might as well use it as a place to kind of assemble the existing information and add to it as I can and go from there. And the other reason that I kind of was pushed into is probably the wrong word, but motivated to do this project, I suppose, is because when I was kind of tossing around topics originally in July, the summer of last year, I had a really, really broad range of reactions when I was bringing this topic up, which ranged from you should do something that's more impactful for the environment, this is a waste of your time, to this is Scripps oceanography, why aren't you doing something that has to do with the ocean, to hey, this is really interesting, can you tell me some more? And so just because of the really broad range of reactions that I got, I was like, hey, you know what, maybe this is something that I should look into so people can have, you know, more productive discussions about the topic. So, little context about my project here for you folks. I took a two-step approach. First part, I did a carbon emission study of different methods of burial with Dr. Dan Ziskin, who is affiliated with the Green Burial Council and the National Center of Atmospheric Research. And we just assessed the different carbonic inputs of different burial processes. And then the other part of my project, I went to the state of Washington, Illinois, and Indiana, and I visited a bunch of different cemeteries that all have different certifications that are environmentally based, and kind of just interviewed the management there to kind of see how their communities felt about cemeteries and how their cities felt about cemeteries, as well as kind of what their opinions were of the futures of the industry and kind of the direction that it was moving in. So, first and foremost, how do we get here? Why are we going this direction? In terms of the United States specifically, burial practices, obviously kind of the original that we are all familiar with is going to be embalming. Embalming sort of started in the United States around the Civil War era. It was first experimented with in the United States in particular as a way to transport fallen soldiers from the Civil War back home. And then upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the practice gained popularity because his body was transported from DC all the way down to Springfield, Illinois, where is his final resting place. And along the train ride there, they stopped multiple times and his body was laid in different states, and states in the geographical sense. And people became very interested in the practice, and that kind of made it much more popular within the United States. And then kind of World War I passes, World War II passes, we're having a lot more burials during these periods of time because the population of the country is growing, and people become interested in cremation, in particular, mainly as a method due to its cost effectiveness. It's a lot more cost effective than traditional casket burial. Also, there's physically less decisions that people have to make in the burial process in comparison to traditional casket burial. And so it just kind of simplified the process for a lot of people. And now we're kind of starting to see, as we're becoming more climate aware citizens and environmentally conscious, we are starting to ask questions about the burial processes and the way that we approach death and the funerary industry in our society. And so we're kind of seeing a shift towards this environmental conscientiousness. Same thing we are seeing currently with cemeteries. Cemeteries are a difficult subject for cities, in particular due to their perpetual nature. The land that is used for cemeteries is held in perpetuity because it's really difficult to move bodies after people are buried. If a community decides that they want to either remove or move the physical location of a cemetery, they have to disinter every single person's remains that are located in the cemetery, and they have to receive written permission from every single living relative of that person, no matter how distant. So you can imagine how difficult of an administrative task it is to actually have a cemetery moved. So planning in terms of volume and capacity and physical location for a community are very essential as communities are beginning to be established. Obviously, because you are physically putting human remains in the ground, there are obvious health hazards that can occur if a cemetery isn't properly maintained, or if it's not properly maintained in the short term or the long term. If burials occur improperly, there are hazards that can be related to water tables. As bodies decompose, there can be leachate that can make its way into the water system. Or if bodies at the surface aren't buried properly, it can attract, predators and other kinds of nasty wildlife that communities don't like to deal with. All this is to say, though, if you live near a cemetery of everybody in the room, don't worry. The odds of them actually being taken care of poorly is very low. And as long as regulations are adequately enforced and followed, there is no concern. They are perfectly safe to live near, I promise. This being said, there are current potential for expanding uses as increased urbanization has kind of been a trend across the United States. A lot of urban areas are losing their green space, and cemeteries kind of inherently have a degree of green space because they are a place of mourning and reflection at this point in time in our society. And there are opportunities to kind of expand those uses that currently exist. So with all this, where do we start? As I mentioned, we are kind of moving into a more climate-conscious burial practices across the United States. So my study features these methods of burial. I'm sure most of the folks in the room are familiar with traditional casket burial and cremation. Traditional casket burial either does or doesn't involve embalming. That's a personal choice. And then the body is placed in a casket, which is then placed in a vault in the ground, typically. The purpose of the vault, think of it as a larger casket for the casket itself. The purpose is that it maintains the level of the cemetery ground. So as time passes, if the remains or the casket kind of start to decompose or the soil settles, anything like that, the level of the cemetery itself is maintained, and so it looks consistent across the space. Cremation, I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of. Think of it as taking remains and placing it in a large oven and just heating it until there's nothing left but ash. Cremains, I'm sure we are all aware of and familiar with. Then we have alkaline hydrolysis, which is kind of like flame cremation's little sister. It's also known as water cremation. Essentially what occurs is a body is placed in a large machine in which it is washed with a slightly acidic mixture with water at a really, really high pressure. And it basically dissolves all organic matter of the remains. And it's all broken down to its most basic biotic components. So think proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, that sort of thing. And then all you're left with is the skeleton at the end of the process, and then that is cremated. Then we have natural organic reduction, which I mentioned at the beginning of this, which is effectively also known as human composting. It's exactly what it sounds like. You are composting human remains. The process of this varies depending upon which provider you go with, because it is an incredibly novel and new technology. And so it can take anywhere, there have been reports of it happening in 6 months, but that's really, really fast. It can also, I've heard it taking 8 months, I've heard it taking a year. It very much depends on who you go and have this process done with. Finally, we have green burial, which is kind of the original method of burial in the way we've been burying people for centuries now. It's just kind of got a shiny new name to be a little bit more appealing to environmentally conscious consumers. Essentially, remains are either wrapped in a cotton shroud or placed in a casket that is made of natural materials and then placed straight in the ground, no vault, no embalming, just trying to make all of the materials as natural as possible so then everything completely decomposes over time. So my research questions are here. They involve themes of carbon impacts in methods of burial, kind of approaching land use adaptations and methods of usage that can be expanded in terms of our cemeteries and ways that we can approach the way that we use them differently. And finally, kind of examining how our changing impression of climate and our societal climate awareness is increasing and how that might impact the burial industry and encourage a changing of practices within it. So, methodology. For the first part of my project in which I did that carbon emissions analysis, it was a lot of data analysis, lots of data gathering from industry sources. And then for the second part, I did a bunch of site tours, as I mentioned. I toured sites that were either certified by the Green Burial Council, which is kind of like the leading North American nonprofit for sustainable burial. And then also I toured one site in particular that does not have a GBC certification, but it is a certified arboretum and national historical site. And I kind of thought it was an interesting idea to tour to figure out its usage for like older cemeteries. So moving into my results here, as you can see, there are some bars here that are going to be above the x-axis and some that are below. The stuff that's going to be above the x-axis here, so conventional burial, flame cremation, and alkaline hydrolysis, specifically the FC500 machine, those are all going to have varying degrees of carbon emissions. That is why they have positive representations here. The negative representations on the right, green burial and natural organic reduction, indicate that they are actively sequestering carbon in the process. A couple things about the study that I do really want to mention here. Natural organic reduction obviously looks fabulous. It has a super negative carbon footprint, so it's sequestering a lot of carbon. Studies have shown that NOR does have an incredibly high methane footprint, and my study here did not consider methane. So I just want to make that clear right up front. A lot of NOR facilities are required to have legally methane scrubbers in their vents externally because of the really high methane footprint that this process does also have. Additionally, in terms of data collection, we did not consider transit emissions or the emissions that come from powering some of these facilities, just because they're incredibly variable depending upon where somebody may pass away versus where they want to be buried. It's just really highly variable, and so we just didn't want to touch it and try and estimate it just to try and keep our data as accurate as possible. So all of this is to say, I just want to point out, green burial might not look super fabulous in comparison to NOR, but a lot of the methane emissions that do come from NOR are naturally sequestered in the ground with green burial. You don't see that methane emission because the soil naturally sequesters it on its own. Then from my site tours, in the state of Washington here, I toured Hillcrest Cemetery, located on Bainbridge Island and privately held. I toured Cedar Lawn Cemetery, which is located in Redmond, Washington, and is corporately owned. And then I toured the City of Sumner Cemetery, which is city-owned and also, interestingly, managed by the city's park services. All of these sites possess a Green Burial Council hybrid certification, which essentially just means that they have adopted some of the language that the Green Burial Council uses, and then they also have a green burial section. There is another certification that I will be discussing in a moment as well. In the state of Illinois, I toured Graceland Cemetery and Arboretum, which for the record is right by Wrigley Field, if you're familiar with the city of Chicago at all. It is level 2 Arboretum certified, and it is also a National Historical Site. It is owned in a trust. The Board of Trustees, I believe, is about 12 people. The level 2 Arboretum certification essentially just means that they have over 100 actively logged trees on their property. And they also have some other very interesting kind of ecological features there. In the center bottom photo here on the slide, they have like a prairie walking area in the back of their facility. This is the only cemetery that I toured that is technically full in comparison from its original plot plans. And so they have a space that is a prairie-style walking area. There's signage back there indicating flora and fauna that you might see throughout the facility. And also, they unintentionally host a family of coyotes, which you can see here on the left of the slide. The coyote itself probably doesn't look a whole heck of a lot like a coyote because they're very well fed. And the director that I spoke to said that they haven't been having problems with wildlife for multiple years now. Finally, the other Green Burial Council certified cemetery I toured is in Montgomery County, Indiana. It's called Oak Hill Cemetery. They have a natural certification, which is one step up from a hybrid certification. And essentially what that means is when they're applying for this GBC certification, it means that they have an environmental impact assessment done. So they actually are actively assessing how their operations are affecting the environment. As you can see in this photo at the bottom center of the slide here, all of the grass that is taller than what has been cut is all land that they still have available to do burials in. And the plots that are kind of just in front here is their green burial section. They have a section A, B, and C. The stake here in the ground is just for section A because that one's full. And they're planning on adding some wildflowers and walking paths in the future. In general, results of my site tours, people are generally interested in more sustainable methods of burial, but access to education has been difficult, which is kind of why I'm here. Generally for cemeteries and organizations within the funerary industry, I have found that obtaining some sort of environmentally focused certification can be useful. And also, every single place that I toured said that their city plans and their climate action plans don't involve cemeteries whatsoever. This also happened in my own research when I was looking at cities in the state of California. And so I would just like to encourage cities to kind of open the floor for these kinds of discussions and encourage these discussions to happen more. So some opportunities for continued research here. Cultural traditions, kind of assessing how they adapt and evolve over time is going to be very interesting as our burial methods within our society continue to evolve. When cremation was first introduced, the Catholic Church was very, very against it, and now they're okay with it. So things change over time, and assessing kind of how that happens could be a very interesting point of study. Additionally, economic impacts. I have very much been advocating here for cemeteries and other members of the funerary industry to get these kind of sustainable, environmentally conscious certifications. There were only 4 sites that I toured that had Green Burial Council certifications, so having a larger sample size and actually doing an assessment like that could be very, very useful to draw more substantial conclusions. Then policy assessments just about the different methods of burial, because burial law does vary on a state-by-state basis. And acknowledging just kind of the differences that exist on a state-by-state basis could be very useful. Finally, sociological assessments in how we all discuss the topic and approach the topic could be very interesting in order to encourage us to engage in more beneficial conversations. Finally, just some acknowledgements out here. I really want to thank my fabulous committee, Dr. Arby and Dr. Zizkin for being very useful in my study, my chair, Dr. Corey Gabriel, for being a fabulous a flying buttress of support, if you will, throughout the entirety of my project. This topic is not an easy one to handle, and so I do very much appreciate it. I also want to thank the GBC and all of the cemeteries that I toured for their expertise, time, and willingness to talk to me. I appreciate that you guys didn't think that I was creepy at all. And then I also want to thank both my parents, Mom and Dad, and Abby. She can't join us virtually today, but I know she'll watch this back. And then also I want to thank the cohort, because you guys are the best. Thanks, guys. Questions?
You said the laws vary substantially from location to location, state to state. Where is this legal?
When you say this, are you referring?
The greener options.
Okay. It kind of depends exactly on the method you're looking at, but in particular, the really new one, NOR, natural organic reduction, as of this weekend, it was legalized in a dozen states. I actually submitted my paper for this project on Friday, and this issue is evolving so rapidly, my paper's actually already out of date. My paper states that 9 states have it legalized. It's actually a dozen now. I think Maine, I know, did it on Friday, but it's a very rapidly evolving issue. And so if you folks aren't from around here, I would encourage you to kind of keep an eye on it, because I know there are states that have pending bills as well. My home state of Illinois, it's sitting in the Senate right now, I believe. I've been keeping my eyes on it. So yeah.
Could you go back to your chart about the emissions?
This one?
Yeah, what's the difference between green burial and natural organic reduction?
So green burial is the style of burial in which a body is wrapped in either like a shroud, or so just like a large piece of cloth, typically made of cotton, or a more natural casket, so wicker or pine. And then it is placed directly in the ground. Natural organic reduction is a process that's done often in urban areas that lack space for cemeteries. And it's where remains are physically placed in like a pod in a facility and then slowly rotated over time until they literally reduce to compost. So then what you have at the end is actually compost as opposed to a grave site, if that makes sense.
Is that compost usable
Yeah.
for agriculture and so on?
A lot of NOR facilities, depending on the state and regulations, you can either take the compost home and stick it in your yard if that's your personal preference, or a lot of NOR facilities also have their own little like tree farm, tree preserve sort of things that they can place your the compost in as well.
Thank you.
And I think I'm out of time because Corey's slowly approaching, so no, don't be.